journalist who discovered too much. Killing the messenger won't kill the message. An explosion happened before any siren, police, or explanation. A grey Peugeot 108 twisted, with the horn stuck, blaring non-stop as if the car itself was screaming. A man ran toward the fire. He was barefoot. He didn't feel anything, just the heat hitting his face, his eyes. On the other side, a woman and a child were crying in panic, repeating, "What do we do? What do we do now?" The young man didn't know either, because inside that car was his mother. Her name was Daphne Galizia. When he looked inside the car, he saw nothing, no body, no silhouette, just fire. It was as if she had simply disappeared. Seconds later, reality appeared in a crueler, harsher way. Parts of the body were scattered around the area. Daphne wasn't just anyone. She was a journalist, an investigative journalist, one of the most unsettling voices in Malta. She investigated corruption, political schemes, money laundering, power games involving businessmen, ministers, and international interests. The attack occurred on October 16, 2017. And from that moment on, it wasn't just one life that ended. That explosion tore apart the image of an entire country. Malta, which is a small paradise in the Mediterranean, a member of the European Union, also known for being a major hub for online gambling, offshore companies, citizenship sales, and the movement of fortunes whose origins sometimes can't be explained. 3 men would later be identified as the perpetrators of that crime. But from the very beginning, one thing was clear. This story wasn't just about who pressed the button for that explosion. Because the question that lingered in the air since that day was different, simple, and at the same time frightening. Who really wanted Daphne silenced? I'm Marcos Campos, and in today's episode, we're investigating that possible answer. If you enjoy real cases, subscribe here. We post episodes weekly. Become a member if you can, or just like and comment to support us. Deal? Announcements made? Let's get to the facts. Before she became a well-known name around the world, Daphne was basically a Maltese woman who never swallowed injustice, at least not in silence. She was born on August 26, 1964 in Islama, Malta. The oldest of 4 sisters, she was the daughter of Michael and Rose. She studied at several traditional schools on the island and later entered the University of Malta, where she graduated in archaeology and specialized in anthropology. But her rebellious side showed up early. Even before she turned 18, Daphne was already going out to protest against the government, and she was even arrested for it. In other words, this confrontational attitude didn't start in the newsroom. It started back in her teenage years. In 1985, she married the lawyer Peter Galizia, and from then on, she started using the last name that would later become known all over the world. The couple had 3 children, Matthew, Andrew, and Paul, and Matthew in fact would follow in his mother's footsteps, later joining the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. In journalism, Daphne started at the Sunday Times of Malta. She became a columnist and later moved to the Malta Independent, where she worked until the end of her life. She also created a magazine, was an editor, a consultant, but what really defined her was investigative journalism. She started investigating everything that intersected with power there in Malta. Corruption, nepotism, suspicious political contracts, money laundering, the relationship between the government and the online gambling industry, sale of passports in exchange for investments, and most importantly, international connections involving tax havens. This led her to earn 2 opposing labels. For many ordinary people, she was a kind of heroine, the only voice that said what no one else had the courage to say. For politicians and big businessmen, she became the hate blogger, the poisonous pen. She really confronted, above all, the Labour Party, which came to power there in 2013. Her columns combined investigation and blunt opinion with no filter or diplomacy. The outcome: Lawsuits, smears, constant threats. At the time of her death, Daphne was facing 43 defamation lawsuits, many of them filed by members of the government itself. And then a question arises that might change everything. How did a journalist on a small Mediterranean island manage to bother so many powerful people like that? To the point that someone decided the only way to silence her was with a bomb? At some point, Daphne's investigations started to touch on a very sensitive point, the direct connection between politics, big business, and structures that, according to her, had characteristics of organized crime. She started naming names, two in particular, Conrad Mizzi, then Minister of Energy, and Keith Schembri, Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. From then on, her routine became a real hell, almost daily death threats, legal, political, and personal pressure. You could kind of see this kind of pressure, these threats. It seems like those she put a target on kind of took it personally. Similarities, right? What she was investigating was a web of offshore companies, money crossing borders, and government decisions that, on paper, seemed legal, but in practice, didn't add up. Daphne revealed that Mizzi and Schembri owned companies in Panama, created right after they won the elections, and that these companies started receiving million-dollar transfers from a company registered in Dubai called 17 Black. These amounts, according to documents she analyzed, were paid in installments that totaled about $2 million. 17 Black in turn belonged to a Maltese businessman named Jorgen Fenech. Here's a key figure in the story, Fenet or Fenech, I'm unsure of the correct pronunciation. He was also a director of the consortium responsible for a major gas power plant project, one of the main campaign promises of the government elected in 2013. But as Daphne dug deeper into the investigation, she realized that the company that would actually operate the power plant wasn't Fenech's, but SOCAR, the state energy company of Azerbaijan. Just look at that. The question she began to raise publicly was, why were two high-ranking government officials receiving money from a company in Dubai owned by a Maltese businessman, connected to a project that, in practice, would be carried out by a foreign state-owned company from Azerbaijan? It's all very complex, isn't it? To her, this had all the signs of an influence peddling and money laundering scheme. She started publishing, connecting documents, offshore contracts, financial flows, and the more she wrote, the clearer it became that she wasn't dealing with improvisation, but with organized, protected, and politically shielded structures. In the final months of her life, Daphne went even further in her investigation. She claimed that the Prime Minister's wife, Michelle Muscat, also had a company in Panama and that this company had received about 1 million euros linked to the family of the President of Azerbaijan. The reaction was immediate. The then Prime Minister Joseph Muscat went public and called the accusation the biggest lie in Malta's political history. He called for early elections and ordered an inquiry to prove that the accusations were false. He won the election. The inquiry was concluded after Daphne's death and officially declared that there was no evidence against his wife, but by then the journalist's image was already deeply polarized. For part of the population, she was the only one standing up to the system. For the other, she had become a public enemy. Shortly before she died, Daphne said she didn't feel like she was in Malta. It seemed like she was living in a hostile place, dominated by primitive practices, and that the situation was desperate. Naturally, no one here witnessed or knew everything that happened. I believe that's almost impossible to know exactly, but her investigation seemed well-founded, very thorough. And it's amazing how certain people have this power of persuasion, right? That when they're confronted, they come out in public. They create a narrative so that their admirers and fans start attacking the one who pointed out the problem. When things are about to be uncovered and the stink comes out, the spell backfires on the sorcerer, right? In a good way, because that would actually be a good thing, wouldn't it? If there really was a rotten corruption scheme going on there, that's bizarre, isn't it? Well, this journalist's son, Matthew, always claimed that there was also a component of misogynistic hatred in all of this. A woman exposing with irony and data powerful men who were used to never being questioned. The threats weren't just talk. Her house was vandalized, feces were put in her mailbox, and the cruelest message came through the animals she loved. Her 3 dogs were killed. One was beheaded, another poisoned, and the last one shot. Even so, she kept writing, and this is where the story starts to get even more disturbing. Because after everything she revealed, after all the names she put on the table, after all the connections she exposed, according to the investigators, someone decided that lawsuits, threats, and intimidation were no longer enough. And the question that remains is, how close did these investigations get to something that, for certain people, could never come to light? Well, Daphne tried, but as you noticed from this brief context, she was kind of fighting a losing battle, right? On October 16th, 2017 in the afternoon, Daphne closed her laptop and got up to leave for a bank meeting. Her account had been blocked in a strange way, and since she already suspected that her phone might be monitoring her, or rather, being monitored, she decided to go to the branch in person. She actually left the house, but then she came back to get a checkbook she had forgotten. Matthew, her son, was in the living room, right there. He laughed, looked at her, and said something like this. Now she looked at him, smiled, and said something like this. Now I'm really leaving. She went out again and walked to the car, a gray Peugeot 108 which was parked right outside. Through the window, her son still saw her getting in, closing the door. After that, he went back to the couch, put on his headphones, as if he thought it was just another ordinary outing for his mother. Seconds later, when Daphne turned the ignition key, the car exploded. The explosion was so powerful it was heard miles away. A lot of people left their homes thinking it had been a plane crash, an earthquake, something out of the ordinary. Matthew heard it too, ran outside and saw his mother's car in flames thrown to the other side of the street. But when he got closer, there was absolutely nothing that could be done. With technical support from the FBI, the Malta police started an investigation that soon pointed to 3 men, Alfred De Giorgio and his brother George De Giorgio. Also a 3rd man named Vincent Muscat. Despite the last name, he was not related to the Prime Minister. Muscat, according to sources, is a common name there. The 3 were already known to the authorities for involvement in violent crimes and bomb attacks. They had a reputation as enforcers, people who do the job, not the ones who plan it. That raised a basic suspicion, didn't it? So someone ordered that to be done. But how did the police get to them? Well, it all started with mobile phone records. The carrier was forced, or rather the carriers, to hand over all the connection data from the area. There where Daphne lived, which is Bidnia, since the night before the attack. In other words, all movements were being monitored from that point in the investigation. In the midst of this sea of information, 2 numbers caught their attention. They only exchanged messages with each other, and both of them died digitally at the exact second of the explosion. One of these chips received a final message at 14:58 and 55 seconds. Right after that, total silence. That number never showed up on any network again. Forensic analysis found the chip was not in a standard cell phone, but in an industrial remote control device using short message service. A module called SIM-900A used to operate equipment remotely. According to the investigators, it was this message that detonated the explosive, a high-powered military device installed under the driver's seat. In other words, the bomb didn't go off when she started the car, it was triggered by someone who was somewhere else. By tracking the system's technical trail and checking surveillance and phone records, police identified the 3 perpetrators. They were arrested in 2017 and confessed years later, but the key piece was still missing, right? Who gave the order? That answer would start to emerge in 2019 with a name that was little known to the general public until then. Melvin Thuma. According to prosecutors, Thuma acted as the intermediary, connecting those who wanted Daphne dead with those willing to kill her. In exchange for a presidential pardon, he decided to talk. It was from his testimony that the puzzle started to take shape. Just before dawn on November 20-20, 2019, the story shifted dramatically in Malta, involving one of the nation's most influential businessmen. Jorgen Fenech was arrested by the armed forces on his yacht while allegedly trying to leave the island, according to police. This businessman is the one who had that complicated connection with a company in Dubai, the Azerbaijani government, all that mess. Until then, Fenech was considered untouchable. Owner of one of the largest real estate and investment conglomerates in the country, extremely wealthy, politically connected, protected. Interestingly, Daphne had never directly mentioned his name in the report she did, but an offshore company linked to him, 17 Black, remember? That's right, it was the centerpiece of her investigations and the secret payments to Conrad Mizzi and Keith Shembri. According to the prosecution, Fenech feared that Daphne was about to expose the entire structure behind the power plant scheme, the offshore companies, and the international connections. And that if this came fully to light, his career, his businesses, and his freedom would be at risk. So it's worth killing for? According to the prosecution, he was the one who hired the middleman. The middleman in turn hired the hitman. Mastermind, bridge, triggerman. Fenech's arrest caused an unprecedented political crisis. In the following months, leaks, testimonies, and legal battles began to dominate the news. A public inquiry was launched to determine whether the state itself had failed to protect Daphne, even knowing that she was living under threat. The pressure became unbearable, and that question, whether the state had failed, is almost a rhetorical question, isn't it? In December 2019, Prime Minister Joseph Muscat announced that he would resign. He officially stepped down in January 2020. In July 2021, the public inquiry was categorical. The Maltese state was found responsible for the murder, for having ignored the real risks to the journalist's life, the risks she was facing, and for not having taken measures to protect the woman. In 2022, the brothers Alfred and George Di Giorgio were each sentenced to 40 years in prison for detonating the bomb. Vincent Muscat was previously convicted for his role in the attack. This Vincent is not connected to the Prime Minister. All of them, according to the prosecution, acted under the orders of Jorgen Fenech, who is still awaiting trial. The European Union continues to keep Malta under surveillance. Precisely because of this case, which has become a symbol of how organized crime, politics, and money can become intertwined within a democratic state. And so the circle closes in a disturbing way. The journalist who was investigating an offshore company called 17 Black, the international energy and offshore scheme, the businessman behind this structure, and the bomb that killed her. Daphne's body was returned to her family on October 27, 2017. The public funeral was held on November 3 at the Mosta Rotunda. Thousands protested, the country stopped, and the government declared national mourning. The Mass was celebrated by Archbishop Charles Cicluna, who, in front of journalists from all over the world, said a phrase that would become a symbol of that case. May they never tire of being the eyes, the ears, and the voice of the people. Because, as Daphne's story showed the world, you can even kill a messenger, but the message, that cannot be erased. The similarities, right, between the links in these chains, which involve a lot of power. That's the same all over the world. You can't mess with the hornet's nest. That's why we see so much injustice, corruption, and things that make us feel suffocated like a nightmare. When you're being victimized by something, when someone is chasing you and you can't scream, maybe that's the best analogy relevant to make about all of this. Thanks for your company. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.